Welcome to the Four Lakes Church of Christ, meeting here in Madison, Wisconsin. We're so glad to have you with us for our midweek Bible study. Today we are beginning a brand new study of the book of 1 Samuel. So we hope that you'll find a Bible of your own and be joining us in 1 Samuel chapter 1. We'll be there in just a moment, but as always, if you have any questions or comments about today's class, if there's something we can do to encourage you spiritually, if there's something that we need to be praying about, we invite you to get us a message. So send a message by email to info@fourlakeschurch.org. You could also reach out by phone or text 608-224-0274. And as always, we would love to hear from you. By the way, the picture on the screen was taken on my trip through Death Valley, I believe it was, this last September, just less than a year ago. I worshiped in Las Vegas on Sunday morning at the Bright Angel congregation. I was actually visiting a visitor who used to attend in Madison very sporadically because she had family here, and so she would come here every once in a while. We would pick her up and give her a ride to church from off of Park Street. And I knew she was from Las Vegas. I knew I'd be passing through Las Vegas. And so finally got to meet her on her turf and got to be there at the Bright Angel congregation. But a good reunion, good seeing her again. And so I worshiped there on that Sunday morning in September. Then I headed north through Death Valley. And I tried to go to Death Valley a couple years before that, but Death Valley was closed. I didn't know you could close Death Valley, but Hurricane Hillary came through, washed out a lot of roads. You may remember that a number of years back. But things were back on track, and so I finally got to go to Death Valley last September. I think it got near 120 degrees that day. Absolutely amazing, terrifying in a sense, you might say, but really amazing. I thought my sandals might melt. And when I can use one of my own pictures for a class like this, then we don't need to worry about any copyright issues. So no problem there, and I don't think I mentioned it yet, but the picture we're using for our study of biblical families every Lord's Day morning this quarter is a picture that I took of Hickman Arch in Capitol Reef National Park. And I took that picture the day before this one, as I remembered. I was passing through Utah on my way to worship in Las Vegas, and I stopped for a quick hike to that arch that we've been seeing in our Sunday Bible class every week. But again, we're starting a brand new study of 1 Samuel this week. I don't know whether we realize this, but 1 Samuel is basically a continuation of the book of Judges. It could almost, in fact, be Second Judges, at least the first few chapters of this book. You may remember, if you've been here for a while, it took us around 22 years or so to cover the entire Bible on a verse-by-verse basis in our midweek study. So we covered all of it, and we were going back and forth between the old and the new, the old and the new, and so on. And a few years ago, once we finished every verse in the whole Bible, we went back to the very beginning. And this time, instead of going back and forth between the old and the new, we've been going just straight through it. So up to this point, at least. So we're not stuck with that. We have the right to make some changes, but we're just going through in order. So a few years ago, then we started in Genesis. We've been covering roughly one chapter every week. And here we are a few years later. We're now at the beginning of 1 Samuel. And like I said, 1 Samuel is basically a continuation of the book of Judges. And to give us more of the big picture, I'm putting up a basic outline of Old Testament chronology. This is something we've used through the years, and I've put a box around where we are right now. So toward the end of the time of the Judges pretty much span very roughly 400 years from the crossing of the Red Sea, or the Jordan River rather, under Joshua in 1445 BC up until the reign of Saul in 1043. So roughly a 400-year period. And we don't have exact dates throughout this period, but this is the rough chronology here. And I want to note, though, that Samuel, although the book is named for him, is not necessarily the author of the books that bear his name. So he's obviously a main character in this book, but he's not necessarily the author of every word. He might have written some of it, some of the material that we have in 1st and 2nd Samuel. But I would say, kind of like the situation we had with Moses writing the first 5 books of the Bible, we actually read about Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy. And I think most of us understand it may be somewhat difficult to write about our own death. And so also with Samuel, he wrote maybe a lot of it, but not necessarily all of it. But Samuel does, in fact, do some writing. And I thought about putting this on the screen. Feel free to look this up on your own. 1 Samuel 10:25. We'll get there in about 10 weeks. But 1 Samuel 10:25, the text says, "Then Samuel told the people the ordinances of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before the Lord. And so Samuel did, in fact, actually do some writing. And in a sense, he wrote about him doing some writing. So that's kind of cool. And then we also have an interesting reference to Samuel at the end of First Chronicles. This is First Chronicles 29:26 through 30. This is what the text says. First Chronicles 29:26 through 30. Now David, the son of Jesse, reigned over all Israel. The period which he reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned in Hebron 7 years, and in Jerusalem 33 years. Then he died in a ripe old age, full of days, riches, and honor, and his son Solomon reigned in his place. Now the acts of David, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with all his reign, his power, and the circumstances which came on him, on Israel, and all the kingdom of the lands. And so I'm just sharing those scriptures just to remind us that Samuel did some writing, but others did some writing as well. And it seems as if someone then compiled these documents into what we know today as the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. By the way, 1st and 2nd Samuel used to be one book. However, the book of Samuel was divided into two books by the translators of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was made in Egypt a number of years before Jesus arrived on the scene. It was the translation that Jesus used as he taught and spoke in Greek. And the reason Samuel got divided is because the scroll of Samuel was too long to be practical. And so also with Kings, so also with Chronicles. I know today we talk about scrolling through a document, don't we? And we understand what that means. However, we need to realize they also scrolled through documents, but they were scrolling literally. And so when a scroll gets to be more than about 60 feet long, for example, it gets really difficult to find something in it. It gets more difficult to carry. It is physically heavy. It's a roll of papyrus. And it also gets a whole lot more fragile. If you've got a 60-foot long scroll, more things can go wrong. And so the translators of the Septuagint split Samuel into two scrolls. And that division, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is still with us today. In 1st Samuel, we read primarily about the lives of Samuel, King Saul, and much of the life of David, although David does not officially take over as king until we get to the book of 2nd Samuel. Before we get to the text of 1 Samuel, I also wanted to show our chart on the judges again. This is something we should be familiar with. I shared this every week for like 20 plus weeks a few weeks ago. But I want us to note that Eli and Samuel seem to be judges themselves. At least one of them is called a judge. I don't know whether they're both called judges, but definitely they served as leaders toward the end of the time period of the judges. And I think most people would refer to them as judges, and they serve as something of a transition to the time of the kings. And let's remember the book of Ruth also takes place during the time of the judges. We don't have that on the chart here, but Ruth most likely takes place early on in the time of the judges, maybe during the days of Gideon, give or take a little bit. Okay, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we'll be learning about a man by the name of Eli. And we'll find that Eli served as a priest in Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant was located. And Eli does seem to rule over God's people in some way. So I would think of Eli as being judge number 13. And then Eli is followed by Samuel, a godly man many of us would consider to be judge number 14. So we're looking at judges numbers 13 and 14 in the book of 1 Samuel. And so Samuel would then be the last judge before Saul takes over as the first of the kings. So that's kind of how we're breaking it down. Before we get to the text, I also wanted to put this up here real quick, and a chronology of 1 Samuel. I was typing all the way through 2 Samuel, kind of summarizing some of the dates, and it got to be where the print was too small. So I'm like, let's whack it. We're just going to do 1 Samuel on this one slide, keeping it large. And I reserve the right to make additions and corrections to this as we move through this book, as I restudy this again over the next several months. But this is a rough outline of some of the big events of this book and where they take place in terms of dates. And so we can plug some of this in based on how long we know some of these men lived and some secular events that take place during this time period and so on. And so let's just kind of keep this timeline in mind as we progress through 1 Samuel. So there's kind of the chronology And we'll look at that again from time to time. All right, let's jump into the text tonight. We'll take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And again, this is toward the end of the time of the judges, at a time when everybody was doing whatever was right in his or her own eyes. So chaos ruled, and people were doing some terrible things, but it would kind of go in cycles. So they'd do well, and then they'd fall away, and then there'd be oppression, and God would send a judge. That whole cycle we learned about in the book of Judges. So we're just going to jump kind of right into this time frame, kind of another appendix to the end of the book of Judges in a sense. So this is 1 Samuel 1, 1 through 8. Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah. But the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Well, first of all, some of us as husbands may be cringing right there, so not a good move on his part, that last statement. We'll get back to that in just a little bit there. So anyway, in terms of main characters here at the beginning, we have a guy named Elkanah, so the husband, and Elkanah has 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah has multiple children, and Hannah has no children at all, so that's kind of the background here. And let's notice what we know about Elkanah as a husband and father just based on verse 3. If verse 3 is all we had, he would go up to Shiloh to worship on a yearly basis. And so I think that should impress us. Even in a corrupt and spiritually chaotic society, this man still worships God regularly. So he's not an idolater. He's not sacrificing children to Molech. He's not doing any of that weird stuff that we kind of read about in the book of Judges. So this guy is an exception to that time of chaos. He would worship God regularly. And again, during the days of the judges, chaos reigned. So this guy is doing something right, even when many around him were not. In verse 3, we're then introduced to 2 priests, Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli. And we learn almost nothing about Eli here other than his name. However, later on, we'll be learning that Hophni and Phinehas are totally corrupt, absolutely terrible human beings, and they're in the religious leadership. And so I think this is probably why we have their names listed here, where we're heading towards something. But I would just point out that Elkanah was not worshiping the priest. He wasn't giving these things to the priest directly. He was worshiping God. So I'm just saying Elkanah was doing right, even when the religious leaders of that time were not. And we don't learn about their corruption until, I think, next week. Then in verses 4 and 5, we find that on the day Elkanah offered his sacrifice to God, he would then give portions to his 2 wives, Peninnah and to her sons and daughters, but then he would give a double portion to his other wife, Hannah, even though she didn't have any children of her own, and maybe even because she didn't have children of her own. So you would think the lady with all the kids probably normally would have had a bigger portion, but that's not the way this went down. So Hannah is clearly the favorite wife here. He loves her more, but she's not able to have kids, and even though that's the case, he gives her double the amount that he was giving to that other side of the family. Unfortunately, notice the consequences of that favoritism, and we're going to see this in verses 6 and 7. Because this was the tradition in his family, Peninnah would harass and completely humiliate Hannah over her inability to have children. And that's a terrible thing to do, absolutely terrible. So God was causing this, apparently, but they didn't know that. And so Peninnah was relentless, harassing Hannah year after year after year. Peninnah kept having children. Hannah remained childless for many years. Peninnah continued harassing Hannah over and over again continuously. It was so bad, in fact, that Hannah would weep and she couldn't eat, so it was affecting her health, her appetite, especially around the time of the yearly sacrifice. And that's when it seemed to come to the surface due to the husband giving a bigger gift to Hannah than he would give to Peninnah. Before we continue, do we see any trouble here with polygamy? I mean, obviously we do. This is not God's original plan. Remember, having multiple wives is not what God intended. That was not his original plan for marriage. As we've learned here a number of times over the past few months in sermon form every Sunday, God's plan from the Garden of Eden was one man, one woman to be together for life. And only later do people start having multiple wives. And it was never really approved or commanded by God. Instead, I would say it was merely tolerated by God. In other words, God allowed it. He regulated it. He set some rules kind of protecting the women in that situation. But God never endorsed polygamy. He never recommended it. He never said people should have multiple wives, as I understand it. Well, in light of the ongoing harassment by one wife against the other, Elkanah gives what is one of the most husband answers ever. So his advice to Hannah down in verse 8 is to ask, why are you crying? Why are you not eating? Why are you sad? So he apparently doesn't know. So that's kind of first kind of clueless husband clue right here. He doesn't know. Maybe he's just starting the conversation, I guess. I shouldn't say that. I don't know. But then he suggests that he as a husband is better to her than if she had had 10 sons. Now, from a man's point of view, if I'm dealing with a woman who hasn't eaten and is crying and all that, perhaps Elkanah was doing the best that he could. So maybe we could give him a pass in a sense on that. But from a woman's point of view, I'm thinking Elkanah might have fallen just a little bit short here. And you're married to me. What more could you possibly want? That is probably not the best answer in this situation. So let's continue and see what happens next. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Up in verses 9 and 10, we find that Hannah is at the temple. The tabernacle, it's interesting, it's called the temple here. It was really the tabernacle, but we understand, if this was written later, maybe kind of accommodating in the language here, but she's praying at the tabernacle or temple, depending on how you look at that. Eli the priest is also there, and he's sitting near the doorpost. So as the religious leader, he's sitting, he's kind of watching things happen, people come and go. And, he's dealing with millions, literally millions of people in the nation, and they're coming to worship at various times and all that. So here's this woman, so Hannah, terribly distressed. And Hannah is praying to the Lord. We know this, so we've been reading this. She's weeping bitterly, and as she prays, she makes this vow. She makes this promise to the Lord. If you give me a son, I will dedicate that son to God all the days of his life, and a razor will never touch his head. And it's not stated specifically here, but I think most of us recognize what's going on here. And again, we're not told in the text here, but it sounds like Hannah is referring to the Nazirite vow. That was what we learned about previously. It's what Samson did. It's a special kind of above and beyond type vow. It was not mandatory. This is for if you want to be extra super duper spiritual and connect with the Lord and set apart in some special way for God's service. And so, as we think about her making this promise, I think we should ask, what is she thinking here? What role does she envision her son taking in the future? And if we think about that, I would suggest that Hannah might be thinking of Samson. And again, we aren't told, but since this takes place during the time of the judges, I don't think it's too much of a leap to think that Hannah is perhaps asking God, please make my son the next Samson. So I'm not swearing my soul on that. I'm just saying that it's interesting that she is offering to make this vow or do this thing for or to her son in a similar way that did in fact happen to Samson earlier in this time period. And I want to point out she's not asking arrogantly. This isn't out of pride. She is asking by way of service. The nation needs help right now. Let my son be your tool to rescue these people from the wickedness that they find themselves in. So let's continue 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. 1 Samuel 1, 12 through 18. Now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, "How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you." But Hannah replied, "No, my lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation." Then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him." She said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So here we have Hannah weeping bitterly. She's praying. She's making this incredibly serious vow to God. And as this is going on, we find that Eli starts paying attention. So like it catches his eye. He's, look, there's something going on over here. And Eli thinks this woman is drunk. So her lips are moving, but there's no sound coming out. And she's obviously distressed. And she's kind of losing it over here. And so Eli, the high priest, thinks this woman has been drinking. And to me, it's interesting how Eli handles this. I want us to note, he doesn't go tell somebody else, does he? And he also doesn't immediately, I don't know, like kick her out. I mean, he confronts this situation. He doesn't ignore it, but he actually speaks to this woman and he starts the conversation and he expresses what he thinks that he is, and then he listens, and there's a little bit of back and forth there. So I think I would commend Eli on not just brushing this under the rug, but he actually pays attention to what he sees as a problem and tries to take care of it, which, by the way, he was not doing with his own sons. We'll get back to that soon. So here's a kind of a thought question, something for us to consider. If you come to church on Sunday morning, if you walk in worship, and if we think someone might be drunk during the worship assembly today, how might we handle that? I can tell you that we have faced this a number of times through the years right here in the city of Madison. Imagine that. And I've said something to the person. If I suspect it, kind of thinking of Eli here, I pull the person aside and, I'll say, "Hey, I smell it on your breath. I see you're something's wrong." And we'll talk about it. And I know many people, when they see something like that, may try to ignore it. But it is a pretty serious thing to show up drunk for worship. And we want people with us, but we also want people to be sober-minded as they're worshiping the Lord. We think about Nadab and Abihu and the whole context there back in Leviticus 10, I think it is. They offer unauthorized fire, and then immediately after that, God says, "Don't drink on priest duty." So it's kind of an interesting connection there. We don't want to be drunk in worship. Nevertheless, Eli confronts Hannah, and she responds, "I'm not drunk, I'm praying." And Eli takes her word for it. He replies with what seems to be a pretty encouraging statement. And he wants God to grant her petition. And, this seems to have cheered her up a little bit. She heads home, she eats, she's no longer sad. And I do find it interesting that prayer often has a way of changing our perspective on things. So I want to point out, God has not fixed this situation yet, but Hannah prays. She has this interaction with the priest. It changes the way that she sees things. And I think there's a value to that. So often, also today, prayer has a way of rearranging our priorities. So even if God doesn't directly answer, if we go to God in prayer, we approach him, it has a way of rearranging the way that we're thinking about something even before God responds. And I would just say it seems like we see that in this passage. So let's continue with 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. 1 Samuel 1, 19 and 20. Then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, "Because I have asked him of the Lord." So in verse 19, Elkanah and his family, they get up early, they worship, they go home. And it seems to me that as soon as they get home, Elkanah has relations with Hannah. So this is not some miraculous birth, is it? I mean, these two, they need to do their part, and they do. And it seems that she conceives almost immediately. And in verse 20, she gives birth to a son. She names this son Samuel. There's some discussion on this. It seems that Samuel is a name meaning God has heard, or something to that effect. There's some ambiguity there, but a lot of people, I think, would say it means God has heard. And I would just note here that some of the great leaders in Bible times started with some rather unusual birth and conception circumstances, didn't they? We think about Moses and the whole thing there and putting him out in the reeds. We have Samson, we have John the Baptist, even Jesus. It's just interesting that Samuel's birth was the direct answer to Hannah's prayer. And God certainly played some role in that, and we're thankful for the answer to those prayers. Okay, let's conclude this week with 1 Samuel 1, verses 21 through 28. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned, then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. Elkanah her husband said to her, Do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him, only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with a 3-year old bull, and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and brought the boy to Eli. She said, Oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. After the birth of Samuel, some time passes, and Elkanah once again heads up to Shiloh to offer his yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But this time, notice Hannah does not go up with them like she normally would, but she stays behind, and her argument is, I'm going to stay behind until the child is weaned. And her reasoning is, once the child is weaned, then I'll go up to worship, and I will simply leave him there then to serve the Lord from that point forward forever. In verse 23, that sounds good to Elkanah. Obviously, kids are weaned at different times in different cultures. Some have suggested that it might have been, 3 or 4 years perhaps at this time. We don't know for sure. There's no date on this. But we assume she's not leaving a 1-year-old in the temple. I hope that makes sense to most of us. I'm thinking he's got to be older than that, but he was young. So 3, 4, perhaps 5, somewhere in that range I would suggest. And eventually that time comes. And so Samuel is weaned at whatever age that was. And so she comes in with a pretty significant sacrifice. And notice she brings wine. So she was accused of being drunk. Now, a few years later, she's bringing a jug of wine. I don't know. That's kind of an interesting thing to note here. But they bring the boy to Eli the priest. And Hannah reminds Eli, I'm the woman who stood here praying. I don't know. I kind of think like I'm the drunk lady. That's not what she said, but I'm the one. And I think obviously he would have remembered that. And it's a wonderful prayer. And I think that's been our prayer for our kids through the years. And I've encouraged both. You don't need to serve the Lord full time like I've done. But wherever you land, use your skills to serve the Lord and to encourage the preaching of the gospel. And that's what she's doing. Her kid is going to serve. In verse 28, Hannah explains to Eli that she has dedicated Samuel to the Lord for the rest of his life, and he worships the Lord. In the New American Standard, I'm not exactly sure what the he is at the end of verse 28, but it may be that Samuel is the one worshiping here, even as a 3 or 4-year-old. And I just think that's interesting. So at this point, Hannah breaks out in song. And we'll get back to that one next week if the Lord will. So that brings us to the end of 1 Samuel chapter 1. In terms of big lessons, I think we learned something here about the value of praying for children and praying that God will use our children in his service. So there's a value for us praying that. There's also a value for our children when we pray that. And there's certainly a value long-term for the kingdom of God. God can use children in his service. And that training starts early, even before they're born, as we prepare for those kids to be born. Next week, we plan on taking a look at Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving, as well as some terrible things that are happening in the tabernacle at that time. But as always, if there's something we need to be praying about, some way we can help or encourage you, reach out, send an email, send a text, make a call, 608 224 0274. And as we close, let's go to God in prayer together. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful for your servant Hannah, for her faithful endurance, even though she was mocked and harassed. We're thankful for her example of prayer, not just one prayer, but we know she must have prayed often for many, many years. We're thankful for her sacrifice, for dedicating her son to your service, and we're looking forward to learning more from the life of your servant Samuel. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. We come to you in his name. Amen.